Hi, this is Deboki, and over the past week I've been talking a bit about books and diversity thanks to the BookTube Diversathon, and I wanted to carry over some of those ideas now to talk a little bit about diversity in science and academia. I think science in particular has a pretty notorious reputation for being pretty weak at diversity. There's some pretty well-known gender disparities in a lot of fields. There's definitely a lot of well-known racial disparities in the US in different fields. I think diversity is important for any field. I think in science, when you're dealing with collaboration, when you're interacting with people, which really makes up the best science that you can do, diversity is even more important because it really maximizes just how much you can get out of your work. I saw a lot of these diversity issues kind of firsthand in college. I went to a engineering science kind of focused school, and when I was there, I think there were maybe only a little bit more than 30% of the school was women, only a little bit. And yeah, there's definitely, even when it came to race, it was definitely mostly white, and then I think like East Asian and South Asian. So definitely I think that impacted how the student behaved. I think that it impacted kind of what people thought it was appropriate to do. And I really liked the school and I really liked the student body, but I think this lack of diversity created an atmosphere that, at least to me, was incredibly frustrating. And when we talk about gender, one of the ideas that comes up kind of, in these broad conversations is that the reason why the gender balance is so off is that as a culture in the US, we are not sending messages to young girls that are encouraging them to go into science. I think this is kind of consistent with some of the things that I talked about in my Defining Diversity video, where I talked about how the messages that we send in pop culture can often inform how we view different people and, even ourselves, like informs what we think they can and cannot do. And so when you don't see women doing science, say in TV or movies, that can really, or they really are just there to play an intellectually subservient role to the men, that's gonna warp your perception of what women are capable of. Personally, I don't think that I grew up with that mentality, but I think that's because I came from a family and a culture that's very academic. My whole family is basically filled with scientists, or doctors or engineers, like basically some version of those. My mom is in chemistry, and she always wanted me to do science all the time. My dad's also in chemistry. My grandparents on my dad's side were both in science. My grandmother, actually, she went to Oxford on her own on a scholarship to do her PhD in chemistry, like, no big deal. She also, I kind of grew up with a lot of stories of her, well, basically these like poor British boys at Oxford who were like, oh my god, this Indian woman with this shari, her shari is gonna get set on fire with this Bunsen burner. Like, they were just like petrified for her, which is ridiculous because she knew what she was doing. But yeah, basically I grew up with a lot of real life examples of women doing science, and I was in one of those families that really pushed me into the field. But that's really just my background, and I'm lucky that that worked out for me. But I think to ensure that other girls grow up with the same kind of encouragement, there's a lot of practical kind of solutions that people are engaging in. So things like science camps for girls, or toys that are marketed towards girls that give them kind of the hands-on experience of like engineering, to like give them some ideas about what it's like. And I think these are awesome because kids are naturally just so curious and so motivated to just build things that it makes sense to, to create these camps and these toys that give them a way to channel that curiosity, so that hopefully, that they'll continue to maintain that interest, within like 5 years and 10 years and 20 years and 30 years. The other kind of less hands-on approach is from companies that are putting out these advertisements basically trying to encourage girls into science. And the one that I think of the most when I think of these ads is from Verizon. And in their ads, they talked about how we basically, when we talk to young girls, we always tell them that they're pretty, but we don't necessarily tell them when they're being smart. And on its own, that's a message that I agree with, and I think like that kind of approach is always worthwhile. I always like the idea of putting things out that encourage us to consider our behavior and actions and how they impact others. Against the broader backdrop of how women are treated in different areas of science and in different workplaces, though, I actually find this kind of frustrating. In general, anytime I see a company put out an ad talking about how we should encourage girls into science, I want them to also be required to include a statement on how their specific company deals with sexual harassment in the workplace, or the hiring practices that they use when they're like, trying to tackle issues of diversity. Here's the not so secret of science. Women have been doing science for a very long time. It's not like my grandmother was the first scientist. It's not like Marie Curie was the first scientist. It's not like Ada Lovelace was the first scientist. Women have been doing science forever. The idea that we don't like science or that our brains are somehow not wired for it and that's the reason we don't do it, those are all bullshit. To me, it's this combination of the broad cultural atmosphere and the specific workplace atmospheres that are most discouraging to women. It creates this negative feedback loop where the lack of women in a field actually makes it harder for other women to break in because they're trying to enter a place that's not necessarily going to treat them well. So one example of this is from this really great Planet Money episode that I'll link to below, called When Women Stopped Coning. And in this episode, they basically talked about how when programming, like digital programming, started being a thing, women were actually very heavily involved. A lot of early computer programmers were women, and they were enrolling in classes at a really high rate. But then in 1984, the number of women kind of enrolling in these courses started to plateau and actually started to decrease very sharply. And one of the reasons that they give for this in this episode is the fact that in 1984, personal computers started becoming a thing. And when they became a thing that people were trying to sell, the companies in general who were putting these personal computers out decided that they wanted to market it to boys and men. That reflects a cultural message of who should be using computers. It translates over into the millions of movies we have out there about nerdy computer geeks who for some reason are all dudes. And that ultimately also translates over into who actually populates the college courses down the road, because they end up becoming all the guys who were kind of had these personal computers marketed towards them. And it's amazing to think how much of this cultural shift came down to potentially just this marketing decision. And it's an example of how this cultural narrative can actually shift the gender breakdown of one field. The other major factor is just how given groups of people are treating their female colleagues. They don't want to put up with bullshit like Rosalind Franklin did when Watson and Crick basically came in and stole her work and used that to uncover the structure of DNA and got to take a lot of the credit. I feel like every female scientist I've met knows this story, and they feel that like bitter sense of commiseration with Rosalind Franklin and will basically correct any person who accidentally or deliberately attributes the structure of DNA to Watson Crick, because it's just like the story that I think hits a nerve in a lot of us. And this kind of issue manifests in so many different ways, and I think we're still figuring out how we're going to deal with them. How we're dealing with them is also changing from generation to generation of scientists. I was at this talk last year from a female professor who's pretty established in her field. She studies video games and gaming in general and the culture, I guess. And I found most of her talk really interesting up until she got to this point where she started talking about Gamergate, and it kind of hit like a needle scratch moment for me. So in particular, she was talking about this documentary that was made about Gamergate, and she was asked to show it at her school because it's kind of relevant to her field. And she said no. And her reason is that she felt that showing this movie to the students would basically discourage women from wanting to go into this major, that they would see this movie and be like, well, gaming world sucks, I don't want a part of it. And I get that, I get that, because you don't want to portray your field as this toxic place because it's going to be discouraging to people. I think her attitude reflects perspective that happens in some women where, yeah, sexism and misogyny exist, but if you just put your head down, get your work done, and get through it, that's the best way. That if you focus too much on negative things, you'll get distracted by them or potentially burnt out. And I think that's probably true for some women. And I certainly think the women who ascribe to this mentality are rewarded for it because, A, they're doing work, and B, they're not speaking out potentially on major issues. There's some things that they're not rocking the boat on. But I don't think that this is a sustainable way to create an environment that is welcoming to women. With the internet, I think women are being given a platform to discuss their views with other people, as well as to experience more harassment. What I want to know is that the place that I'm going to be working at is going to be comfortable with me being vocal about these issues, and potentially also try to confront them. I also want to know that if I have a problem, my concerns aren't going to be dismissed as me being too sensitive. I think a lot of women my age are seeking the same validation instead of accepting this idea that we might be making too much of a fuss and not spending enough time on our work. And I think this is super important for academia because there's so many ways ways that women can be subject to sexism, both subtle and overt, that are made all the worse when the people that they're experiencing it from are tenured professors, and thus, seem impossible to confront. So the writer Azine Ghorayashi at BuzzFeed, she's been putting out a lot of really great articles about different sexual harassment cases at different universities. It's included a series of articles about Geoff Marcy, a famous astronomer at Berkeley, who basically had been harassing students from 2001 to 2010. And what was most infuriating reading these stories is that students had been bringing complaints about him throughout that whole time. And it was well known within the community, within the school, that this was a problem. There was also basically a network of women who had to tell each other, just don't work for this guy, he's a creeper. Power dynamics exist in any workplace, and I don't really know that much about how sexual harassment cases work in, real companies. But I think what happens in academia is that there's this informal formality to kind of the whole social structure that makes it really hard to feel protected if you're a student, especially if you're a student accusing a famous professor who brings in tons of money and tons of acclaim to the university. I'm lucky to work in an environment where I feel protected, but I could easily see how, if something happened, I would feel impotent, going against, someone who might be a really well-known or well-liked professor. A lot of these issues are not unique to science and academia. They're prevalent in so many different places, but I think coupled with the messages that we put out about women in science, they really make it understandable why women might not want to pursue careers in this area. Things like, trying to factor in children with tenure clocks or having your work be popularly attributed to you. They're all things that even I'm considering, and I know that I want to stay in some kind of career that's related to science. But yeah, this is still only a very surface level discussion of diversity, and probably this is not going to be the last time I talk about it. So I don't know what else I will have to say, but yeah, if you want to talk about any of these things further or, argue with me or whatever, please, use the comments, use Twitter. I like discussing these things and kind of getting a better idea of, where I'm coming from, where other people are coming from, and yeah, so bye.